When I first drove into Willow Creek Estates, I felt like I had found a secret pocket of paradise. The road dipped and curved through a corridor of tall oak trees, their leaves glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. Then, just beyond a rise, the lake came into view, and I knew right then that this was where I wanted to live. The realtor beside me smiled knowingly when I gasped. "It's the crown jewel of the neighborhood," she said. "The walking trail runs all the way around it, perfect for morning jogs or weekend strolls." That image sold me. Quiet evenings on my back porch with a glass of wine, the lake glittering like a sheet of glass in the twilight, a place where I could breathe, far from the noise of the city. I signed the papers 2 weeks later and moved in before summer hit full stride. For the first few months, everything was perfect. I walked the trail almost every morning, just me and the birds and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. On weekends, I took my kayak down to the small dirt launch and paddled across the still water until my arms ached. I waved at neighbors and they waved back. The place felt like a community, quiet, respectful, and proud of what we had. Then, one Thursday morning in early September, I woke to the sound of hammering. At first, I thought it was a neighbor building a deck, but when I stepped outside, I saw workers down by the trailhead. They had dug post holes and were raising black iron fence sections like a prison perimeter. By noon, the entrance to the trail, the very path that ran behind my property, was sealed behind a tall gate with a shiny new lock. I marched down to the workers. "What is this?" "HOA orders," one of them said, not even pausing his work. "HOA orders for what?" "This is the trail." "We use this trail," he shrugged. "Gotta take it up with the board, ma'am. I just build what they tell me." I was furious. That evening, I fired off an email to the HOA demanding an explanation. 3 days later, I got their response. A sterile, condescending message full of legalese about liability, misuse by unauthorized persons, and a new lake access permit program. If I wanted to use the trail or the lake, I had to pay $500 a year, in addition to the $200 annual HOA dues I was already paying. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. I showed up early, still angry but hoping this was some kind of misunderstanding. The board sat at a long table at the front of the clubhouse, looking smug and self-important. At the center sat Greg Winters, the HOA president, a tall, lean man with slicked-back hair and a permanent politician's smile. When it was my turn to speak, I laid it all out. "This is extortion," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "We already pay dues. You can't just fence off community property and charge us extra to use it." Greg leaned back in his chair like he was bored. "Mr. Collins, the board voted unanimously to implement the permit system for the good of the neighborhood. We had issues with trespassers, vandalism, and liability risks. This is the most efficient solution." "I've lived here 6 months and I've never seen a single trespasser," I shot back. "This is just a money grab." Some of the residents nodded in agreement, but more of them were nodding with Greg. A few even applauded him when he talked about preserving property values and keeping the community safe. I realized then that I was outnumbered. I refused to buy a permit out of principle, but it stung every time I looked out at that locked gate. I could still see the lake from my porch, but it felt like it had been stolen from me. The fence became a daily reminder that I had paid a premium to live in a place that now treated me like an outsider. Weeks passed, then months. My anger cooled into a slow, simmering resentment. I stopped waving at neighbors. I stopped going to HOA meetings because it just made me more bitter. Then, one Saturday morning in late October, I noticed a man in a red pickup truck parked by the gate. He had a clipboard and was pacing the ground, stopping now and then to make notes. I walked over. "You with the HOA?" He looked up. "Nope, Martin Realty. Surveying the property line for the Johnson parcel." "Johnson parcel?" I repeated. He pointed past the gate. "That strip of land between the fence and the lake belongs to an old family trust. They're putting it up for sale. We're marking boundaries before we list it." I stared through the bars at the narrow path that ran down to the lake. That land couldn't have been more than 15 feet wide, but it was the choke point for the entire walking trail. If someone owned it, they could block the HOA's gate completely. "Do you know the asking price?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The man shrugged. "Won't be cheap, but it's not exactly prime real estate either. The family just wants to unload it." When I got home, my heart was racing. I looked up Martin Realty online, found their number, and called. By Monday, I had an appointment to see the listing. By Friday, I had made an offer. It was more than I wanted to spend, but the thought of owning the very ground the HOA had fenced off lit something inside me, a mix of defiance and giddy excitement. 2 weeks later, my offer was accepted. When the deed arrived in the mail, I sat at the kitchen table staring at it for a long time. I owned the strip of land that contained the trail entrance. The HOA's gate was technically trespassing. I called Greg that evening. He sounded impatient until I told him why I was calling. "You bought it?" he said after a long pause. "Yes," I said. "And as the legal owner, I'm notifying you that your gate is on my property without permission. You can negotiate a lease with me if you want to keep it there, or you can have it removed." For the first time since I'd met him, Greg didn't sound so smug. "We'll have to discuss this with our attorney," he said tightly. "Do that," I said and hung up. That night, I stepped out onto my porch and looked at the lake. For the first time in months, I smiled. I had leverage now, and I intended to use it. Greg called me back 2 days later, his tone clipped but calmer than before. "Mr. Collins, the board has reviewed your claim of ownership. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss a possible easement agreement." "Sure," I said, "but understand that I'm not inclined to give you free access after what you pulled." He gave a little huff through the phone. "We'll see what we can work out." The meeting was set for the following Tuesday at the clubhouse. When I arrived, the whole board was there, Greg at the center, flanked by 3 other members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. A lawyer in a gray suit sat at the end of the table, a briefcase by his feet. Greg started with a speech about community harmony and mutually beneficial solutions, but I could tell they were rattled. Their lawyer explained that while the HOA still technically owned the trail, they couldn't legally access it without my permission because my strip of land was the only way in or out. "So here's what we're offering," Greg said finally, sliding a paper across the table. "We'll pay you a modest one-time fee for an easement so we can keep the gate where it is. In exchange, you agree not to obstruct access or charge residents for entry. I didn't even look at the number." "Not interested," his smile twitched. "Mr. Collins, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable," I said. "You locked me and everyone else out of the lake for months. You forced people to pay extra just to use what they already had. I'm not selling you an easement. You can either take the gate down or I'll have it removed myself." The lawyer cleared his throat. "You would need to give formal notice." "This is formal notice," I said. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Greg's jaw worked like he was chewing gravel. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "The board has the authority to levy fines if you interfere with HOA infrastructure." "Good luck collecting them," I said, standing. "Have the gate off my land in 10 days or I'll do it for you." I walked out before they could say anything else, my heart pounding. I had no idea if they'd call my bluff, but I knew I wasn't going to back down. The next 10 days were tense. I caught Greg driving past my house more than once, glaring at the trailhead like it had personally offended him. A couple of neighbors stopped me to ask what was going on. I told them the truth, that I owned the land now and that the HOA's gate was trespassing. Reactions were mixed. Some cheered me on, others looked worried. On the morning of the deadline, the gate was still there. I called the contractor I'd lined up and gave him the green light. By noon, a crew was out there unbolting the gate and loading it into a truck. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching, feeling a rush of satisfaction as the last panel came down. 2 hours later, Greg showed up at my door. "You can't just tear down HOA property," he shouted before I could even say hello. "Actually, I can," I said calmly. "It was on my land. I gave you 10 days to move it and you didn't. Now it's gone." His face was red. "You're going to hear from our attorney." "Good," I said, smiling. "I'll be ready." That night, I put up my own gate. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy wooden gate with a heavy-duty lock. It wasn't to keep people out permanently. It was to remind the board that this was mine now. I kept the key in my pocket and went to bed feeling like I'd just won a small war. The next week was chaos. Word spread quickly that the trail entrance was locked again, but this time by me. People started knocking on my door, some politely asking if they could use the path, others angrily demanding access. One woman from down the street accused me of ruining the neighborhood. "The HOA ruined it first," I said, refusing to open the gate. "I'll unlock it when they get rid of the permit system." A few days later, I received an official letter from the HOA claiming I was violating community standards and threatening to fine me $100 a day until I reopened the trail. I took the letter straight to my lawyer, who drafted a response pointing out that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property and that any attempt to fine me would be challenged in court. After that, the fines stopped coming. Weeks went by. My gate stayed locked. I started using the trail again myself, unlocking it for my morning walks and locking it behind me when I returned. I saw neighbors standing on the other side sometimes, watching me with a mixture of envy and resentment. One morning, I found Greg waiting for me when I came back from my walk. "This has gone on long enough," he said. "You've made your point. Just give us a key so people can use the trail again." "Not until the permit system is gone," I said. He glared at me. "You're holding the whole neighborhood hostage," I smiled. "Funny, that's what you did when you put up that fence." He left without another word. A month later, the HOA sent out a notice. The permit system was suspended pending further review. It wasn't a full victory yet, but it was enough for me. The next morning, I left the gate unlocked. People started using the trail again, cautiously at first, then more freely as word spread. I watched from my porch as families walked by, kids on scooters, dogs sniffing happily at the grass. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt alive again. But I knew Greg. He wouldn't give up so easily. And I was right. A week later, I received another letter, this one not from the HOA but from their attorney, claiming that while I owned the land, the HOA had an implied easement based on decades of use. If I didn't permanently reopen the trail, they would sue. I read the letter twice, then set it down and stared out at the lake. I'd come too far to back down now. If they wanted a fight, I was ready to give them one. The lawsuit hit 3 weeks later. A thick envelope landed in my mailbox with a satisfying thud full of legal jargon and accusations. The HOA was suing me in county court, claiming an implied easement, interference with community resources, and even emotional distress on behalf of residents. I took the packet straight to my lawyer, Linda Patel, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for dismantling HOAs. She flipped through the papers with a small, amused smile. "They're bluffing," she said finally. "Implied easements are tricky, and they usually don't hold up unless there's no other way for the property owner to access what they own. The HOA technically owns the trail, but your land is the only legal entrance. You control access. Period. So they don't have a case?" "Oh, they have a case," Linda said, "but it's a weak one. They're trying to scare you into backing down. If we fight, it'll cost them a fortune in legal fees." I grinned. "Good. Let's fight." The next few months were a blur of filings, depositions, and tense meetings. Greg showed up to every hearing in a crisp suit, always with that smug expression like he was certain he'd win. But as the case dragged on, I noticed cracks forming. The HOA board started looking nervous. Rumors spread that their legal bills were draining the community budget. One night, I got a knock on my door. It was Daniel, one of my neighbors, a quiet guy who lived 2 houses down and usually kept to himself. "Hey," he said awkwardly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" I invited him in, and he perched on the edge of a chair, looking like he was doing something dangerous. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "I'm on the HOA Finance Committee. Greg isn't telling people how much this lawsuit is costing. We've already burned through the legal reserve fund, and now he's talking about a special assessment." I raised an eyebrow. "Meaning every homeowner will have to pay more just to keep suing me?" Daniel nodded. "He thinks he can force you to settle before people realize what's happening. But if the board calls a vote on the assessment, it could get ugly." A slow smile spread across my face. Then maybe it's time people knew the truth. The next day, I made copies of the HOA's financial reports, anonymously supplied by Daniel, and dropped them in every mailbox on the street. By the end of the week, the neighborhood was buzzing. People were furious that Greg was spending their money on a lawsuit instead of fixing potholes or repairing the pool deck. At the next board meeting, dozens of residents showed up, demanding answers. I sat in the back, arms crossed, as Greg tried to talk over the shouting. "This is about protecting the community's rights," he insisted. "No," someone yelled. "This is about your ego." The board barely escaped the meeting without being shouted down. 2 members resigned the next day. Greg was stubborn, though. He pushed ahead with the lawsuit, and soon we were in front of a judge. Linda argued calmly and precisely, citing property law and presenting survey maps showing that the HOA had no recorded easement. Greg's attorney looked flustered, When the judge ruled that the HOA had no legal right to keep the gate on my property without a formal easement agreement, which I was under no obligation to grant, I nearly cheered. The lawsuit was dismissed. Greg stormed out of the courtroom without looking at me. But even with the case over, the tension didn't disappear overnight. Some neighbors still saw me as the villain, the guy who had locked everyone out for months and forced the HOA into a legal war. Others treated me like a hero. It was awkward walking the trail now, nodding to some people while others turned their backs. Then came the special election. With 2 board seats empty, new candidates stepped up, people who ran on platforms of transparency and fairness. Daniel even ran for treasurer. I quietly supported them, talking to neighbors, handing out flyers. When the votes were counted, Greg barely kept his seat, and the rest of the board flipped. At the first meeting of the new board, they voted to permanently abolish the permit system. Greg voted no, of course, but he was outnumbered. The motion passed, and just like that, the trail and lake were free again. That might have been the end of it. But I wasn't quite ready to let things go. One morning, I unlocked my gate as usual and found a laminated note zip-tied to the post. It was from Greg, demanding that I leave the gate permanently open or face further action. I laughed out loud. Further action? After everything he'd lost? That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the deed to my strip of land. An idea began to form, not just to end this feud once and for all, but to win. The next week, I put the strip up for sale. Quietly. No HOA involvement, no neighborhood notice. I contacted a local conservation group that had been trying to secure public green space around the lake for years. They jumped at the opportunity. When the sale went through, I hosted a small gathering at the trailhead. Neighbors came out curious. Even Greg showed up, arms crossed, looking suspicious. This land now belongs to the Willow Creek Greenway Trust, I announced. It will remain permanently open to the public, free of charge. No HOA fees, no permits, no restrictions, ever. The crowd broke into applause. Even the neighbors who had once glared at me smiled. Greg's face, on the other hand, turned a deep shade of crimson. "You can't just..." He sputtered. "I can," I said, and I did. "This fight is over." I turned and unlocked the gate, swinging it wide. For the first time in over a year, it stayed open, but I could tell from the look on Greg's face that he wasn't done with me yet. For a few glorious weeks, things were peaceful. The trail was open, families strolled by in the evenings, kids rode their bikes around the lake, and even the ducks seemed to quack more cheerfully. I thought maybe finally Greg had accepted defeat. Then, early one Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of power tools. The noise was coming from the trailhead. I threw on a jacket and ran outside. There they were, Greg and 2 hired workers installing a brand new metal gate, right on the edge of the Greenway property. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted. Greg turned, smiling like he'd just checkmated me. "HOA has a right to control traffic through its community. We're putting up a gate to regulate hours of use." "This isn't your land anymore," I said, my voice rising. "You can't block the public from entering." He crossed his arms. "We're not blocking. We're just restricting after dark to prevent vandalism." I could feel my blood pressure spiking. "You lost this fight, Greg. Take it down," he smirked. "Call whoever you want." The board approved it. I did call, not just my lawyer, but the head of the Willow Creek Greenway Trust. By noon, a representative showed up with a copy of the deed and a police officer in tow. The officer listened patiently, then told Greg he had 24 hours to remove the gate or face fines for obstructing public property. Greg's face turned purple. "This is harassment," he snapped. "No," the officer said calmly. "This is the law." The next morning, the gate was gone. I thought that would be the end of it, but Greg had one last card to play. At the next HOA meeting, he introduced a new bylaw proposal to install a private fence along the back of all properties adjacent to the trail, paid for by a special assessment. "This will restore privacy for residents," he said smoothly, "and prevent certain individuals from interfering with HOA decisions in the future." It was a naked power grab, and everyone knew who he meant by certain individuals. I stood up. "This is ridiculous. You're asking everyone to pay for a fence that benefits no one but you, just because you lost." But Greg was persuasive. A few people actually nodded, clearly still bitter about the months the trail had been locked, so I took a gamble. "You know what? Let's vote. Right here, right now. But before you vote, consider this. If you pass this bylaw, I will build my own fence. Right along the property line. 12 feet tall, legal height limit. And I will paint it the most hideous color I can find. I will make sure that every person who walks this trail sees it and remembers what this HOA tried to do. There was a ripple of laughter through the crowd. Some people actually clapped. Greg's smile faltered. And one more thing, I added. If you try to pass a special assessment to fund this nonsense, I will call a special meeting and campaign to have you removed from the board. I have the signatures for it already. Daniel stood up then, clearing his throat. As treasurer, I can confirm we don't have the funds for this project without a massive assessment. And after the lawsuit, we can't afford another fight. I motioned to table the proposal indefinitely. Another board member seconded it. And just like that, Greg's grand plan died. For the first time since I'd moved in, I saw something new in Greg's expression. Not anger, not arrogance, but defeat. After the meeting, he walked up to me. For a moment, I thought he might take a swing at me, but instead he just sighed. You've made a lot of enemies. Collins, he said. Maybe, I said, but I've made a lot of friends too. And it was true. Over the following weeks, neighbors who had once ignored me started stopping by to chat. Some thanked me for fighting back. A few even apologized for siding with Greg. The new board passed rules limiting their own power, including a clause requiring a community vote before any future lawsuits. As for Greg, he resigned 6 months later. No announcement, no farewell party. Just a short email saying he was pursuing other opportunities. I didn't throw a party the day I heard, but I did pour myself a drink and sit on the porch watching the sun set over the lake. The water was still and golden, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The trail was busy that evening, kids laughing, dogs barking, joggers waving as they passed. For the first time since the whole mess began, I felt completely at peace. I still owned my little strip of land, though now it was technically part of the Greenway Trust. I kept my gate up, but I left it open, a reminder of the fight that had been won. One night, months later, I saw Greg walking the trail. He didn't see me at first. When he did, he hesitated, then gave a small nod. Not friendly, not warm, but an acknowledgement. I nodded back, and that was enough. The lake was mine again, not because I owned it, but because I had fought for it. I had learned something too, that sometimes you have to dig in and hold your ground, even when the whole world seems lined up against you. I glanced at the trail, at the open gate, and smiled, because in the end, I hadn't just gotten my lake back, I'd gotten my neighborhood back.